So at this point, I would like to introduce Dr. Amy Sturgis. And she's going to tell you about herself, and she's got some interesting tidbits about science fiction and how it evolved and all that good stuff.
Are we set to go? All right. Thank you for having me here. I'm Dr. Amy Sturgis. I am involved in science fiction in a number of ways. First and foremost, I'm a fan of science fiction and have been all of my life. Under pseudonym, I also write science fiction and a little bit of fantasy and have kind of a bit of a publishing thing going on the side. But my primary interest is I'm a scholar. I do science fiction and fantasy studies. I teach at Belmont University courses like the history of the future, the 20th century through science fiction. I also teach a J.R.R. Tolkien class. Just finished Harry Potter and his predecessors class. So I do a little bit of both of those things. But I've written on yes. Yes. That is an option out there. I allow folks to explore their inner Gandalf in any way they want
Half
to.
the class quit as soon as they went into that.
That is not actually a standard part of the curriculum. But people can do independent research, and if they want to go that way, that's their thing. We had the Hagrid as Taoist monk in the Harry Potter.
That's a stretch.
But obviously, it's a good time to be involved in all of this with cinema doing what it is. But tonight, what I'd like to do is just talk a bit about the history of science fiction, how that fits with technology, and how I see the genre expanding and where I see the genre right now. And hopefully that will fit in enough with the cultural part of PhreakNIC to flick a few digs. First, what is science fiction? The British futurologist George Hay says that science fiction is whatever you find in the bookshelves under science fiction at the bookstore. Brian Aldiss, who both writes science fiction and his history of science fiction, says that science fiction doesn't exist, and basically writes himself out of the cosmos there, because the term has been so expanded and really made shapeless by different changes in the genre. H.G. Wells had a very narrow definition of what science fiction is, and that is it's everything as it normally is with one slight change, one slight technological change, one slight imaginative change, and then it's tracing, extrapolating all of the things that would come from that one single change. Add two changes, it doesn't work. You have to just focus on the one. But I would have a more expansive definition and say that science fiction is a genre, a speculative genre that asks what if? What if X? What if Y? And really the only specific narrow focus of that is that it suggests some kind of plausibility, not necessarily possibility. I'm not saying that this will probably happen, but it's plausible that it could happen. And that is really the difference between science fiction and fantasy. Science fiction says, trust us here, we've got enough levers to pull that it will work. Example, really Frankenstein. Mary Shelley begins by saying, according to most recent theories, this could happen because we're talking about electricity here and how we're harnessing electricity, right? So standard throughout Frankenstein then is that these things must happen for the rest of these things to happen. It could happen. Whereas if you take Dracula, for example, you just have to take a blind leap of faith. Why doesn't Dracula see himself in the mirror? You just have to believe that it's because he doesn't have a soul. Now, the most recent chair I've seen doesn't have a soul, but I can see a chair in the mirror. So it doesn't have to be logical. You just have to take that leap of faith. But the plausibility is the key that kind of focuses that. And the plausibility is where the science part of science fiction comes in. The edges do get blurred, though, and I'll talk about that in a bit, more so all the time. There's one other thing about science fiction, and it's the reason that I am so intrigued by it and have been all my life, and that is the key of intellectual excitement. There's something there that grabs you and makes you want to play whatever game the author or the television creator or the director has going, the what-if game that he's or she's begun. And I like to think of Frederick Brown's paradigm puzzle there as the classic example of the intellectual excitement that is that spark of life in science fiction. When he wrote, "After the last atomic war, Earth was dead. Nothing grew. Nothing lived. The last man sat alone in a room. There was a knock at the door." Science fiction is what opens that door to see who's there. Science fiction, of course, can be traced back to the ancients, depending on your definition. But for all practical purposes, and for the definition I have, I will take it to Mary Shelley. So science fiction had a mother in that sense. In 1818 with Frankenstein, built on that plausibility model, saying it could happen according to latest scientific theories, and she even lists scientists to whom she's spoken. This could happen. And now taking that, let me run with it. Building on romanticism, building on Gothicism, building on genres that were already there. She set the stage for something else. And in her work, set the standard for the fact that science fiction would ask questions about power, about coercion, about individual liberty, about questions that are so intrinsic to what it means to be human that really the genre could outlast whatever immediate technological innovation was what started any particular work. She was careful to show plausibility, and she nested her stories by placing the monster story inside of Victor Frankenstein's, and by placing humanity's story inside of the monsters. So a lot of things were going on there, and by creating a model that was so complex, she opened the field for a lot of people to come out and play. The 19th century it was the perfect moment for her to be doing this too, because of two specific things. First of all, there was Newton, the Newtonian revolution. By discovering and articulating the first real law of science, the Newtonian revolution suggested that perhaps, unlike in the centuries before, were common thoughts, particularly in the West, that there would be a God who could come in and interact with humans regularly and really whimsically, not according to any sort of regular pattern. This law suggested that things will work the same way every time. There are rules, and if God does step in and take part, he plays by those rules too. So you can take those rules to the bank. That really created a kind of ambiguity about the nature of religion, the relationship of religion and nature, questions that had been givens for a very long time. And so there was this open spot created for some literary field to take, for people to run with. And the second thing was the Industrial Revolution, simultaneously in the 19th century, where you have an emerging middle class fueled by technological innovation. The things that were happening in the economy, the fact that these folks could buy things, there was suddenly a middle class that had an income level where there would be opportunities for leisure and leisure spending. The fact that these folks were literate because education was keeping up with the economic changes. All of this was because of technology. As technology changed and made things like the factory system viable, then the way of life of entire nations was suddenly dramatically changed. And in the social upheaval, again, there was an open spot for a literary genre to exploit that big question mark, what if? And based on the questions of coercion, power, individual liberty, what the good life could be, what it meant to be human, the cradle, the foundation for science fiction was well suited to step in and answer those questions of what this new world, economically, socially, politically, educationally, scientifically, would really mean. So that's the stage that's set by history and by the mother of science fiction. And then it was time for the two dads. Science fiction has two daddies to step in, Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. Jules Verne really, in that moment of ambiguity and concern, was praising the ripeness of the way that society was moving thanks to technological innovation. He was very excited about how he saw things unfolding as innovation upon innovation moved more rapidly. His works were called extraordinary journeys, extraordinary adventures. That was the kind of subgenre that he began, with works like Voyage to the Center of the Earth, 1872. Verne, by being so positive in his outlook, created that pro-science feeling that certainly Mary Shelley didn't have, because she was warning that the power that came with technology, the power that came with invention could isolate people and, in the end, give the opportunity for evil to advance. So she wasn't by any means the pro-science person. She was using science and technology to make a point. Whereas Verne is very much excited about this new world that's opening thanks to technological innovation. H.G. Wells' work is considered scientific romances, and he played with the ideas. His work was grounded conceptually in a metaphor of evolution, all of his works based on the notion of evolution, and so therefore very much grounded in the science of the day. But he played with those with a very light touch. He would, in a sense, parody the very things that he was talking about. And 1895's The Time Machine is the classic example of how he could be both playful and melancholy simultaneously about what evolution would mean for humanity. Both of these works by both of these authors, by being both concerned and excited about what technology would mean, set the stage for one of science fiction's biggest contributions, and that is the capturing and taking with technology the subgenres of utopian and dystopian work. That's why Edward Bellamy in 1888 could write Looking Backward, the year 2000 to 1887, and talk about the way he saw the ideal utopian socialist state harnessing technology to make sure that everyone was equal in every possible way. That excitement and that positive outlook could play off of things that were as early as timeless as the classic works of utopianism, but the instrument to get there was technology. Likewise, George Orwell, writing 1984 and 1949, could describe a world, a dystopian world, in which the same kind of state that Bellamy was describing was in fact very dystopian, was very frightening, was in fact the boot getting ready to crush the face of humanity, harnessing technology to get where it needed to be. So utopianism, dystopianism, linked by the growing science fiction genre. Verne, H.G. Wells, both are thinking in terms of physics when they're thinking of the science in science fiction, in the same way that Mary Shelley was thinking of biology and chemistry when she was thinking of the science in science fiction. Verne and Wells' work then would lead to a lot of people doing secondary kind of knockoff, kind of disposable work in which the physics would kind of turn into guys with big guns, right? Which is great. That's what it would be. And in time, the genre would keep that, just like it would always keep and still keeps Mary Shelley's notion of biology and chemistry as the science in science fiction. There is a level of, by ratcheting up that definition of science and adding the physics to it, there is still that kind of science fiction today, where the science in science fiction is physics, and the guys have the big guns. And to quote SLTV, things blow up real good, and that's what they're going for. Two things help the things blow up real good subgenre there, or change in science fiction. And first is the post-U.S. Civil War explosion of pulp publishing, pulp manufacturing of works. 1868 was the first science fiction pulp novel called The Huge Hunter, or The Steam Man from the Prairies. And after that, an entire series of pulp dime novels, basically, that took westerns and just changed them around. So instead of cowboys and Indians, you had basically robots. The Steam Man from the Prairies was like a really big steam engine train that could walk and talk, and was the Indian against the cowboy of the cowboy being the science fiction pulp hero of that era. And they were disposable. Authors were paid by the word, so they had every reason to be as wordy as possible, and pad as much as they could, and leave as many cliffhangers so that they would have to write a sequel. They were meant to be read once and tossed away. But with this emerging middle class, thanks to the Industrial Revolution, that had the money to go and buy these pulp novels, and that had already read through all of the westerns, here was a little twist, the same stories retold in a different way. Post-World War I, particularly in the U.S., the pulp industry explodes once again. 1911, Modern Electronics, the magazine, begins with the great editor Hugo Gernsback. Hugo Gernsback is very pro-science and is forward-thinking enough to recognize that really the future of the United States would be tied to its education in science, to making young people want to learn about science, to inspiring them to being the next innovators. And so even though his magazine was really a how-to, a non-fiction publication about the latest electronic things on the market, he started putting little fictional inserts there that would maybe explain how something that had been described in a non-fiction article might be used in the future in a fictional context. Playing around with the imagination a little bit and inviting the reader to come in and see the possibilities. Something that's unveiled one day in a year or 50 or 100 might be used in this way. And so he encouraged really the first authors to think about science fiction in a serial format, unlike the pulp novels and unlike the great novels like Wells and Verne. Here was a new outlet for science fiction. And in 1926, he created Amazing Stories, which was the first science fiction magazine. He called it scientific fiction. Had an extra syllable in there, trying to figure out how to put the scientific and fiction together. He wanted to make readers love science and love technology, and he looked for authors who would do that. Great authors like Edgar Rice Burroughs of Tarzan and Princess of Mars fame. If any of the characters could be worked into very small metallic bikinis, all the better. The large guns, the bikinis. It was the big boobs and big guns era. But behind that, there was the honest desire by Hugo Gernsback, for whom Hugo Awards are now named in science fiction, was the honest desire to make people love science and to make people, to infect them with that desire to be the next innovators, to be the next turn of technology. Astounding Stories came after that. It became Astounding Science Fiction in 1938. It's now analog. John Campbell, the great editor, 1937 to 1971 would sit at the helm of that publication. So now you have competition among magazines. And the first real literary science fiction authors, Asimov, Sturgeon, Heinlein, would be published in these magazines. And here the divide begins between the science fiction that is every science fiction hater's stereotype of science fiction, that stops with the boobs and the guns and stops when the reader's about 12 years old, and the great literary science fiction that is saying something more, that is rekindling the spirit of Shelley and Wells and Verne and taking it further. That's where the divide came, when those first magazines began to compete, and the difference between the pulp, the disposable, and really the long-lived and compelling great literary science fiction began. By the 1950s and 1960s, the so-called golden age of science fiction, which I think is actually tomorrow, but I'm an optimist. The 1950s and 1960s really was the golden age of science fiction because post-World War II, you had this young audience, really a completely different understanding of childhood than had ever existed, particularly in the United States, with the idea that really part of the Cold War, part of winning the Cold War, was preserving that moment of innocence, that moment of play for children. And what was good for children, in a sense, was good for science fiction, because in the untrained public eye, science fiction was a children's genre. But the children were growing up. By the late 50s, they were growing up and they weren't growing out science fiction, and they were demanding science fiction of real quality. Still, with the definitions of the science in science fiction being biology, chemistry, and primarily physics. And of course, the space race having a great deal of impact on that. Hard science fiction, what we consider today hard science fiction, the physics-based science fiction, really comes into its own. Jules Verne wrote hard science fiction, but in a very satirical way. Think of From the Earth to the Moon, books like this. He played with and had inside jokes for the audience that he knew was educated in a way that would understand his jokes. Wells knew science, but ignored it when he needed to. Think of The First Men in the Moon, books like that. He had a point he wanted to get across, and if he just needed to grab a large talking praying mantis, he would, and he wouldn't worry about actually how it worked, or how it survived, or how they got there to find him in the first place. Writers like Arthur C. Clarke were paying attention, and they were not treating it as satire, were not ignoring it when it was inconvenient, were sticking to the physics, were sticking to the science. And writers like Arthur C. Clarke paved the way for what we consider now to be hard science fiction. And then, if any one person embodied the golden age of science fiction, building on the shoulders of Hugo Gernsback, Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Heinlein. Heinlein was a scientist. He was an engineer. He was trained through the Navy, and during World War II, he gave aviation reports and reports on scientific progress for the military. But he wasn't interested in the science that he understood for its own sake, and that was key. That's what kept hard science fiction from kind of imploding on itself at some point and becoming just a thought experiment for 5 people who got it. He was interested in what those scientific innovations, those scientific principles meant for larger questions about human progress about individual liberty, about power and its abuse, its use, its possibilities for societal evolution. So he is really, truly the intellectual heir of someone like Shelley, but is trained in what Shelley never would have been or would have been interested in. The Puppet Masters, 1951, the first great book of his, but what I would argue would be the high point of his work, 1967's Moon is a Harsh Mistress, in which he was not, again, harnessing the technology for its own sake, just to play with it. He was conducting a large thought experiment. What if the American Revolution were replayed, this time between Earth and the Moon? And the good guys aren't on Earth, they're on the Moon, and how do they fight that war when they're obviously so drastically underrepresented, overpowered, and the underdog? So his big questions weren't about science, but science and technology were vital for him to find the answers that he needed, and for him to think about what it meant to be human and what a better tomorrow, not a utopian world, but just a better tomorrow might look like, and how technology could help get us there. After Heinlein, who was one of the best ever at doing what he did, you see my completely unbiased opinion there, in the 50s and 60s, that whole physics as the science and science fiction moment, I think, peaked. And I think it has, in a way, plateaued ever since then. What happens after that is what I think is really the interesting stuff. And that is new technological innovations in biology, in chemistry, in physics happen. That's why you have Greg Bear and people like that today writing. As the new innovations come fast and furiously, you have people who are educated enough, interested enough, and on the cutting edge enough to take those innovations and play out the ramifications of them in different works of fiction. But the real innovation, technologically, imaginatively, has been in the very definition of science itself. So we have on the timeline the science as biology from the very beginning to today. We have on the timeline the sciences as chemistry, the science as physics as well, playing out. But then with different innovators, we had that definition of science ratcheted up. And by ratcheting that up, by opening that question even further, new authors, new questions, new audience members have been added to the genre. The ghettoized voice that was stuck over there with the, the foil bikinis and the large guns becomes something much more mainstream. And as it expands its old definitions, it expands its voice. The first way, I would say, this definition of science gets changed, gets ratcheted up, as it were, is by defining the science part of science fiction as anti-science. Even Verne was, and Wells, who were either playful with or occasionally dismissive of the science, were positive about the science that they used, even if it was just a literary device. Ray Bradbury is the first person who comes in as a skeptic of science and yet chooses science fiction as his literary voice. The science part of science fiction for Bradbury was a metaphor, and the best example of that is 1950's The Martian Chronicles, whereas Heinlein was taking the technology extremely seriously as an agent of his vision in, say, Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Bradbury was suggesting scientific change, technological innovation, as a metaphor to criticize. In Martian Chronicles, his criticism is about colonialism. So in the tradition of the great post-Civil War Westerns that suddenly became science fiction pulp with just a little twist, he would place, say, the American West on Mars and criticize colonialism, criticize imperialism, criticize the unthinking assumptions lying behind things like genocide, and play them out using technology really as a warning instead of an exciting possibility. He was worried about what science would mean because he didn't believe that science could change human nature, and he wasn't really a fan of human nature. And so more technological innovation simply meant more opportunities for people to do what people do and potentially do them in a bigger and badder way. So using science fiction as his means of criticizing science was very interesting, and that certainly continues all the way to today. The next big leap in the definition of what science is in science fiction, I would argue, would come with Samuel Delany. In that sense, the notion of science would be linguistics, languages. And by who he was, also writing as a bisexual black man in what had been traditionally a very mainstream white man's genre, he also opened up the questions about race and sexuality that had not been there before. I would point to 1966, his work Babel 17, as the real turning point there, because when you look at linguistics as a science, then you can talk about dismantling a language as being a weapon of war. What happens when humans are targeted and attacked by a weapon that destroys their notion of the word I, for example? This is very sophisticated what-if potentials playing out. It's being very concerned about, again, the notions of power, coercion, individuality, what it means to be human, but instead of using the traditional notions of science, you're opening the field for a whole new series of questions. Yes? He did. Orwell did, particularly with his notion of newspeak. Yeah, that's definitely true. I think the difference there is, and also Frank Herbert is doing this. Frank Herbert did everything. It's kind of like talking about, the people and then God. I can't even talk about Frank Herbert because he's bigger than all of this. But you're right, Orwell did. But Orwell used that as one tool of his many. And I think the difference is Delany used that. That was his main focus. But you're definitely right, and Orwell was, in that sense, very much an intellectual father for Delany and for a number of other people, including Ursula Le Guin and others who would use that well. And his entire appendix on Newspeak would be a classic example of that. So you're definitely right. I think Delany focused the attention on that, and because his work was such a turning point, those who might not have gotten it before got the fact that the linguistics was here to stay as a whole separate series of questions. And the notion of war through language then also playing into what would become the postmodern revolution in literary studies also gave science fiction a credibility among scholars it didn't have before, which was good and bad, depending on your notion of how much you want scholars involved in anything. I say that as a scholar. I think a third turning point then would be Ursula Le Guin, by bringing anthropology and sociology so much to the fore. And again, like Delany, changing the whole nature of the questions asked, not only by the tools she brought to the table, but also by the very nature of who she was. Gender, although certainly you had, James Tiptree and the greats before her, Ursula Le Guin, by focusing the question there and by bringing new tools to the table at the same time, meant just by being there that the question of gender was on the table to stay. By bringing anthropology and sociology from a very academic background to to the tableau of tools that could be used, particularly her Left Hand of Darkness in 69 and Dispossessed in 74. Dispossessed playing right into that whole dystopian sidebar that's been going on the whole time. Really, once again, transformed the dialogue by asking what it would mean to have an alien who could change gender at will, to have the very notion of identity no longer tied to gender, and make that a question of scientific analysis. Left Hand of Darkness was just a watershed. As we're ratcheting up the definition, of course, we still have those who are working on the biology, chemistry, physics level, but new voices, new readers, new questions are being asked. I think the most recent and most interesting redefinition or expansion of the definition of science and science fiction comes with psychology. And I'd say that William Gibson's Neuromancer in 1984 finished what Philip K. Dick had started a decade before, but had done in such a way that it hadn't really grabbed everyone by the shirt collar until Gibson did it. And also, of course, brought in cyberpunk simultaneously.
Okay, this is along those same lines of the psychology, but in a completely different way. If you take Maze, like Jack the Body, this, and all of that, I mean, you can't get much more psychological than a being without a body.
That's true. Very good point. Very good point. Yeah, so that's definitely out there. You're right already. And by bringing those issues and making those scientific issues and not fantastical or just mainstream fiction, the dialogue is changed, and by creating characters like Dixie Flatline that then become models for entire generations of authors to think about. And again, Dixie Flatline's fulfilling what Philip K. Dick had done earlier. And certainly the tone of the work, the irreverence, the George, the H.G. Wells irreverence that had been there so early, coming back in the cyberpunk mentality, I think brought in a generation that would not have been tied into a literary movement in another way. Looking at where the genre is now, I think cyberpunk has, in a way, grown up. And grown up through Neil Stephenson. That cyberpunk still exists, but cyberpunk has also taken another generation. As the technology has matured, and it's now not necessarily novelty for novelty's sake, that you're in a virtual reality, then really in the same way that each of the pioneers in science fiction has done, Neil Stephenson can say, now that we're not so enthralled with the fact this just exists, now that we've kind of gotten over the initial shock, what questions can be answered when we play this out? So in a sense, I think Neil Stephenson is kind of a Heinleinian figure in the sense that he can take that then and apply it and see how different thought experiments work out. The furthest implications in that sense for computer technology. Like Mary Shelley, on the individual, on society, on what it means for power and individual freedom. I think Neil Stephenson really proves the flexibility of the genre in that way. Two current situations, then, I would see in the literary genre. Some of the best writers, by going back and forth between science fiction and fantasy, are now really blurring the distinctions between the two. Now you have hybrid works that are completely hybrid works that can't be separated out, and you have authors whose voices are not changing, going back and forth. Lois McMaster Bujold, who is really the Heinlein of her generation in the sense that the grown-up, the 21st century Heinlein, in the sense that she can write feminist military science fiction and things blow up real good. and yet she's also playing with a lot of biological and psychological and sociological things at the same time, and doing it all in space opera. That's a tall plate for one person. And she's also tied Heinlein with the number of Hugos she's won, which makes her the living most awarded science fiction author, and of course Heinlein being her fellow. And then there are other fellow travelers who are in the orbit of science fiction. They're in the orbit of fantasy. They're not really in either one, and they're doing such incredibly interesting things that everyone in both of those genres have to take notice. People like Neil Gaiman, who have transformed everything as they go along and don't really fit anywhere and defy categorization, but have changed, say, in the sense Neil Gaiman being the Lovecraft of his generation, changing genres in which he doesn't even write just by being who he is. The second thing I would say that's happening that's so interesting is that I'd said first the ghettoization had changed as new people were brought in, but now the ghetto doesn't even exist. There isn't the science fiction stuff and then the literary stuff, because really since the 60s, but particularly today, some of the most stellar contributors to the genre aren't even put in the science fiction case that I talked about when I began in the bookstore. People like Mary Doria Russell are considered fictional authors. They write fiction and they're put in the literary fiction category. Yet she wins the Tiptree Award for The Sparrow, and rightly so, and shows that there's still an awful lot that can be done in the science fiction genre. She's writing a science fiction story that handlers refused to put in the science fiction section because they wanted non-sci-fi readers to read it. Before her, people like Kurt Vonnegut were doing the same thing. But today, I think the new voices coming in are just as likely to be routed into literature as they are to be routed into science fiction. And I think that's very exciting as a reader of, and a writer of, and a studier of science fiction. I think that's very hopeful, that in fact the science part of science fiction has grown so wide that even newer folks can be brought in. Yes. I think there's definitely something to that, yes, and to go back and use Gibson as an example, when you have someone naming cyberspace, and 5 years later, 90% of people are in cyberspace. They see that connection, whereas talking in 1870 about being on the moon seems a bit far-fetched. I think that plausibility factor definitely has something to do with it. We're so wired now, no pun intended, for these quick technological innovations that yesterday's science fiction and television certainly has something to do with that as well. When you see the things that are on Star Trek, used the next day at NASA or at your grandfather's, that it takes that immediacy away from the disbelief. So I guess that leaves us then waiting to see what the next leap will be in the definition of the science part of science fiction. Or to use Frederick Brown's paradigm puzzle that I mentioned before, to see to whom that knock on the door actually belongs as we sit there in our rooms alone. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Sturgis, and give us about 10 minutes, and we will have the infamous black hats, white hats, and ass hats, find out which one you are, presentation.